Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. It is a very special day for us here on the show. We're going to get down deep into the roots of one of the largest breaches in U.S. history. Yes, that's right. I've got a very special guest with me here. One that if you've read the congressional reports, you've heard the name. He's the guy. He's the guy. Everyone says he's the guy, but really, he's not. Not because he's sitting here in front of me. Y'all know I've been outspoken about this stuff, but because really, he's not. And we'll get into that during the show today. So you're going to have to wait until we hear from our good friends there at Get Smart Eye to know who my guest is for the show today. All right, guys. So before we kind of get going on today's episode, I want to talk to you about privacy and security, obviously, right? But how many of you guys do what I do? Travel a lot, go work out of coffee shops. You need to get out of it. You need to kind of go brainstorm. You know, you go to your favorite Starbucks, or in my case, my favorite coffee shop here in Atlanta. You sit down, you put in your AirPods, you're listening to your favorite CyberHub Engage or Goodbye Privacy podcast or Journey if you want to listen to music, and you're having a good time. You're up and away working, going over apps, documents, coding, whatever it is that you do for work, analyzing logs, whatever it is, reading a really important email from your boss, and then all of a sudden you see that person kind of staring at your screen, and you go, dude, don't look at my screen. Can't I have some privacy? Well, up until right now, the answer to that would have been, I got to sit in the corner of the coffee shop or the side of the coffee shop to get that. Not anymore. With Get Smart Eye, you don't have to do that anymore. Get Smart Eye is a very cool app that you can use on your phone. It reads your biometrics, so it reads your face. This is how it works. It's looking at your face. So while you're reading a document, it's making sure you're the only person looking at it. Try to put another phone in front of it, take a picture of the document, screen goes black. Someone gets behind you, tries to look at your screen, like that nosy person at Starbucks or wherever, screen goes black. No one can see what you're seeing on your device when you're using Get Smart Eye. So support our friends and my very good friend Dexter, who is not a security guy, who came up with this product on a trip overseas dealing with security guys and went, how come I can see everything you guys see? Isn't that like the complete opposite of security? And he's absolutely right. He's launched this amazing product. So go to getsmarteye.com/James, getsmarteye.com/James, getsmarteye.com/James for a link to download the app and the opportunity to see a free demo of it. This is great for a person, a small business, an enterprise business. If you travel a lot, this is the right app for you. So again, go to getsmarteye.com/James to get access to the app I don't leave home without. So we're back. Graeme, thanks for being here. Graeme Payne, former global CIO for Equifax, right?
CIO for Global Corporate Platforms, yes.
Yes. CIO for Global Corporate. Former.
That's correct.
Of everyone at Equifax, you were the one guy to get the pink slip, right?
As far as I'm aware, that is correct.
As far as everyone's aware. we won't get into that. You've written a your book just came out. It's called The New Era of Cybersecurity Breaches. We were supposed to have you on the show a few months ago. You had some technical difficulties. Very, very happy to have you on the show now. The New Era of Cybersecurity Breaches. You can go get it on Amazon.
Amazon, yes.
Yeah, that's pretty much like the global monopoly.
It's the biggest bookstore in the world. So.
Yeah, it's the global monopoly of bookstores. Thanks, Jeff Bezos. You guys can also find the link for this book on the description part of this podcast if you're listening, or below the description of the video if you're watching. Direct link to take you to get this book. I've read it, not in this hardcover format. I'm very excited to finally have the hardcover format. I read it in its plain good format, and my good friend Phil's on the back here giving a recommendation for the book. Phil's not allowed to interview on my show, by the way, so this is a call out for Phil. overruled. This country was born over defying orders, Phil. But a great book. We're going to get into a little bit of it today, but I'm going to let you guys get it and read it because we don't have enough time to go over this book and everything you went through. I mean, it's just phenomenal. It's awesome. I'm excited to have you on. Thank you for being here, finally.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, Equifax kind of is the motherlode of data breaches for a lot of Americans, although I'd say Marriott got away, I'd say pretty scratch-free for the size of their breach, number one. And number two, the information, their breach was global in scale, and they pretty much got away. It almost died after a week. Mm-hmm. And Equifax stayed in the cycle for like a year. It's still in the news cycle. How do you explain that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think Equifax, well, for a start, Equifax is supposed to be a trusted steward of data, right? Marriott, sells hotel rooms and properties and so on, right? So they're slightly different business model. I mean, the business model for Equifax is the data. So I think that's one thing. And I think the interesting thing about the Equifax data model is the consumers aren't, customers. In most cases, I mean, there are some consumers, but our data is held by the company, provided to Equifax by data furnishers, banks and telcos and utilities, and all those type of. And then Equifax takes that, it generates models and scores and reports and insights off that data, and then it sells it back to those companies. So the consumers' data is there, but they're not really a party to the transaction. So they've implicitly, or maybe in some cases explicitly, consented for that data to be shared. But I think a lot of people, when the Equifax breach occurred, didn't even know who Equifax was, and why did they have all this data about them?
I think most people felt helpless. I'll tell you this. When the breach came out, I told people one thing. And I'm kind of very agitated about this. I'm a vent now early, so we can get over my venting. Equifax should have never settled their class action lawsuit. Bad precedent. Bad. Horrible. It's going to change the cybersecurity breach. It's putting hot on a cup of coffee and then having us put hot on a cup of coffee when you order a cup of coffee before Starbucks was popular and they made cold coffee. It's mind-boggling. You can't prove damages. You can't. All Equifax had to do was give people free free freezing of the credit, free credit monitoring. They could have done that. They could have gotten away with it they could have done it for 5 years. That wouldn't have cost them a lot of money because they own LifeLock. I mean, this could have been easily solved. Now what they've done is they've set a precedent that is going to change the paradigm in cyber forever. And that is that I don't have to prove damages, physical or monetary damages anymore, to get a settlement for a breach. I came on local TV here in Atlanta. I was on 11 Alive and Fox 5. And the one thing I said is go to the DMV, change your driver's license number. Post Equifax. Go. It's the easiest way to know if someone steals your identity with your old driver's license number, you've got somewhere to go. You can actually go to a lawyer and be like, listen, this is my old driver's license number. It was compromised in all these breaches. The lawyer can do something with it. At that point, we've got damages. Now we're settling on there's no proof of damage. None at all.
Yeah. Well, I think there's the cost of getting credit monitoring, which you could say is a cost to the consumer, right?
Correct. But Equifax could do that with LifeLock for free.
Well, and they don't own LifeLock. They're a business partner with them.
They're a business partner.
But you're right. I mean, they could do that for free. But I mean, there's still a cost. I mean, there's an internal cost of carrying that, of doing that. But yeah, and So there's the credit monitoring, and then of course, like you said, there's the credit freeze. You can also freeze in your report, which up until the legislation changed was you had to pay for.
Right.
Right. Equifax suspended that in the post notification period of the breach, but now anyone can freeze their credit report for free. And I would recommend people do that. All three of the credit reporting agencies.
It's free to freeze it. It's free to unfreeze it. They no longer charge you $3 or $6 or whatever it was that it is. But how did you end up at Equifax? What was your journey like through cybersecurity?
Yeah.
Tell us about you.
Sure.
The man.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't born here. I was born.
Yeah. You don't say.
So I grew up in New Zealand, and I actually started my career as an auditor, financial auditor. This was back in the 1980s, and it was funny because back then we didn't really have security people. In fact,
right.
Many of my clients had mainframe systems, and the only thing we were concerned about was posting a guard at the door and making sure no one got physical access to the data center, because it wasn't connected to anything, right? I mean, it's just connected to dumb terminals accessing the mainframe. And so that was your really major security concern, was getting physical access to the data center, because you could do damage or or backup and recovery, right? So if the data center, no one had backup data centers back then, so you needed to take your backup off site. So they were the security issues of the day. So anyway, I started off as a financial auditor, and then I got into what we called EDP auditing, IT auditing, and then into security. And so I spent 10 years in New Zealand working for EY, Ernst & Young, and then transferred over here to the US, and eventually found my way to Atlanta. I was in Cleveland for a couple of years, and then found my way to Atlanta and helped set up the security practice here at EY.
Your first stop in America was Cleveland?
Yes.
Wow.
That was an interesting introduction to the US. But
yes, it is. Yes.
Especially living in a winter, because I'd never experienced, snow like that. I mean, it snows in New Zealand occasionally, but to actually... live in...
Are you from the South Island?
South Island, yeah.
Okay.
South Island.
Because North Island has ski resorts in New Zealand.
Yeah, so does the South Island. But it's, it snows occasionally. And in the city, you might close down for 24 hours. So it's a little bit like Atlanta. But I never experienced, where it could snow for like a month. That's crazy.
And the snow goes nowhere.
I know, it just piles up.
Piles up. You're looking at it, you're like,
Yeah, and then you get to the spring, I should say, where it's just dirty, right? Because it starts to melt, and it combines with the dirt and the mud, and it's disgusting. And eventually it's all gone. But so anyway, I was in Cleveland for a couple of years, and then I moved to Atlanta in '96, and I came here to set up, and we were starting to really get into security in EY, and so I set up a security practice here for the Southeast area. Did that for several years, and then it ended up, I left EY in 2008, went to work for Wipro, the Indian outsourcing company, as a consultant, and ended up running the governance, risk and compliance consulting practice there. And then I guess in 2011, I left there and joined Equifax, and I started there as a Vice President of IT Risk and Compliance. And then later got promoted to become CIO for Global Corporate Platforms. So that's sort of my
long journey.
History. Yeah,
a long journey, and one of almost 8 years at Equifax.
That's right.
So I remember reading about Equifax's kind of security program post breach, and you guys had people think you guys had a very kind of bad security program. Why don't you kind of set the record straight? Because you guys had a fairly mature security program.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it started under Tony Spinelli when he came in around 2009, I think he started there. And, up until that point, the security had been very distributed. And so Tony really set about building more of a consolidated, centralized security team, and hired some really good people. I mean, a lot of those people today are CISOs at, leading companies around the country. So good, really strong team, and centralize a lot of the functions, and I think really start to lay the foundation, build around ISO 27000, and put a whole program together. when I arrived in 2011, they were sort of well on the way of putting that program in place. And as I said, I think had good people and we had a good program, and I think we're well respected in the industry. Now Tony left in 2014, I guess, somewhere around there, and then Susan Malden came in. But and we had there's obviously players which are coming and going and changing, but I still think we had a pretty good program.
Someone told me, and I can't say who, Tony was like the ultimate security guy, and business hated Tony because he took security at what it was, and they wanted to, I don't want to say loosen up security a little bit, but not make it as strict, and they looked for someone who could kind of be more of a business enabler as a security person rather than a security person first rather than a business enabler. I don't know that to be true. I've heard that from multiple sources. I mean, this Atlanta's a small community, and so everyone's worked somewhere at some point, and right. You hear all these different stories, and I don't expect you to comment on that, but I think it's one of those where it almost seemed like part of kind of the program a year before, 18 months before everything kind of came true, was starting to kind of not fall apart necessarily, but had some the acquisition rate and the security budget weren't matching to complement each other.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because, I've spending money, the more you can't, throwing money at security doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right?
Agreed.
It's not necessarily, I don't know if you can draw that correlation necessarily to say just because you have spend lots of money, you have good security. But there was definitely, the company was definitely in a very acquisitive mode. There was a lot of acquisitions. I think 17 acquisitions were done or something like that under Rick Smith's leadership there. So there was a company was growing. It was an exciting time to be at Equifax. I was thoroughly enjoying my experience here because when you're in a growing company, the great thing about growing companies is you can reinvest the money back into the business. Right?
There's energy.
There's energy around it. There's excitement. Yeah. The stock price was doing well. When I started, the stock price was at, I think, around $38, $39, and it was $145 just prior to the breach. So, the company was doing well. People, were being looked after, and it was a good place to work. People were excited to come and work there. People were excited to want to work there. So, it was a good environment from that perspective.
When you kind of think of, and I don't want to focus just on the breach, but rather, when you look at just the IT governance part of it, there was no playbook for what you guys went through when it happened at all. Where did you guys draw from when stuff started happening?
Yeah. So, I think you break it into two parts, right? The first part was for the July the 29th, which happens to be my birthday. I didn't know if you knew that. I think I say that in the book, opening series. So the day that we detected the breach, we first spotted the suspicious activity was the July 29th, which was my birthday. It'd be a great birthday present to celebrate for the rest of my life. We'd rehearsed breaches before, and we'd had breaches before, right? There's no secret about that. They're well known, some of them. We practiced that, but not on the scale. And so the scale here was different, which made it completely completely new thing to deal with. So in the pre-notification period, we pretty quickly got a bunch of advisors, and so Mandiant was brought in as a forensics and cybersecurity sort of consultant. Right. We had King and Spalding as the lawyers. We had communications people. So we had a lot of experts that we started to assemble. The interesting thing is, it was pretty amazing that in that period, from July the 29th, when we first detected the suspicious activity, till September the 7th, when we did the public notification, there was probably less than 100 people who knew what was going on. Now, obviously, that number increased as we got closer to pre-notification, to notification, but the amount of work that we did in that period, we not only did we had to obviously had to do all the forensics to work out who was impacted, we had to start doing hardening of the environment, because obviously whenever you announce that you've been attacked, you're saying that you've got some potential weaknesses. So you want to make sure that
you're inviting other people to come and jump in.
So resetting passwords, putting additional monitoring on, really hardening the environment. So there's a lot of work we had to do that, and again we had to do that in secrecy, because we didn't want to let it out to anyone that something was going on. So that was a huge amount of effort by a small group of people that were able to literally move mountains in a few weeks. I mean, we worked every day. We just had Labour weekend. Well, we worked the entire Labour weekend. We worked every night until everyone got so tired they couldn't work anymore, and then they'd be back at 7 a.m. doing it again, and for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. Anyway, so there was a lot of that stuff going on. And then we had to build and then it's okay, so when we announce, we wanted to be able to say who was impacted and have something for them to protect them. And so what do? We didn't have, our systems weren't capable of handling tens of millions of people logging into our network to be able to determine, whether they're impacted, and then signing up for service. So we had to build a separate portal for people to do that. And so it was another whole team sequestered away, building a web portal in Amazon for exactly that purpose, to determine whether consumers were impacted, and then allow them to sign up for services. And so that whole effort was underway, as well as all the communication preparation and working out who was impacted, and then how we were going to notify the regulators, and then the public announcements and all that sort of thing. So a tremendous amount of work. So that's up to the notification, and then
did you guys have any playbooks to draw from in the pre-aspect, the pre-notification? Was there any precedent? Was there anyone that you could call at the time and be like, hey, how did you guys deal with this?
So we took a lot of advice from people. I mean, we'd obviously had our own experiences on some of that stuff, right? So we
But scale-wise,
no. So I mean, we did leverage our attorneys and the Mandian and people like that had obviously been involved in some pretty significant. So they helped sort of guide us through that process. But again, it was we had a war room, and we had we had a running task list of things that just had to be done, and so we were sort of ticking them off as we were going.
It's interesting for me to hear you say that, because no one's heard that side of the breach.
Right.
No one's heard. One of the things I've always argued and I've spoke about is the cost of a breach on the human capital of an organization. And you just described that perfectly. And I think if you're a listener who doesn't work in cyber, or works in cybersecurity but's never been on the breach side, one of the things I argued with, and I think I wrote it right when I started this podcast about a year ago, I said, no one takes into impact the cost of a breach on the human capital of the company.
Right.
From a turnover standpoint, but also from their families.
Right.
And last year I had the Girl Scouts at our CyberHub Summit. Sorry, that's kind of a plug, but the Girl Scout's father worked at Equifax, and he's in the cyber division at Equifax. And I had her on my podcast as well. She was one of my first guests. We're talking about, she's a Girl Scout. We're talking about the Girl Scout badges, cybersecurity badges. And I asked her, I go, in that period of time, how often did you see your dad? And she goes, we barely saw Dad. Mm-hmm. She goes, he'd come very late at night. He'd shower. He'd be gone by 5:30, 6 in the morning. Wouldn't come home till 1 a.m. And did that for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. And even post-notification, people still worked around the clock.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Well, we will talk about that in a minute. But I would say, in my professional career, is probably the most stressful period of my professional life. I think, that 6 or 8 weeks from the end, because there's a lot of unknowns too, and you're always living under this threat that something's it's going to come out, and all of a sudden we're going to be we're
even more
ready.
Overwhelmed.
Yeah, and so it, as I say, I think it was a testament to the people that were involved that that didn't get leaked out, because we took a whole level of one of the officers in Alpharetta just to sequestered the whole thing because we had all these people working, and there was big signs: "Do not enter." We wouldn't let people come in. We were very careful about what we talked about. It was a stressful period.
And I'm glad, and thank you for sharing that. Being that we're post kind of Capital One, and I wrote a paper where I had Daniel Sergile on because we got into kind of a cool argument on LinkedIn where he says you were deflecting the responsibility, and I was like, I don't think so. I think people have to realize that a breach, and as someone who's been involved in a few breaches in my life, I think there's aspects of the breach that people don't understand, mainly the human capital piece of it. The media is never going to cover it because it doesn't make for a good story. No blog's going to write about it because everyone's really good at Monday morning quarterbacking something after it happens. But no one's taking the human aspect and looking at it and going, well, what does that mean for your life?
Right.
For your vacation? Did anyone go on vacation during that period of time? If you had vacation, you canceled it. I'm assuming this happened in July, August, back to school. I'm guessing there were people that had to send their kids back to school that couldn't be there on their kids' first day of school because of the breach, because they were dealing with this. And correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're totally right. I mean, there was one team I remember, they worked 3 days in a row. I mean, all through the night because we were doing a big change in the network, and, they were just worn out by the end of 3 days. They were sleeping in the conference room, and it was crazy. It was a crazy period. But, and then just to build on what you said there, then when the public announcement comes out, right, then the other 99% of Equifax are like totally shocked because here's all the, people think this, and then there's the questions, well, what happened and which system and who's responsible and so that was interesting just seeing all that happen as well. And I had a big team I managed, and so we had meetings with our team, and they were all concerned. Is the company going to survive? Are our jobs secure? What impact does it? What does it mean to us? And a few people said, "Well, how are you doing?" Which was nice to someone recognized that that I'd probably been in the middle of all this.
You've been under stress for
exactly.
You haven't been the same guy you've been for all the years they've known you for the last.
I know, because I'd been cancelling meetings, standing meetings I'd had with my team and everything. I can't meet today, and so all of those sort of things. Now they recognise why that was all happening, but at the time they had no idea. They were just saying, "This is strange. Something's going on. I'm not quite sure what."
People thought you guys had like a secret project, like an Area 51 kind of thing. We're about to destroy TransUnion and Experian. We're going to knock them out the ballpark. But what happens post?
All right. So post was like, I've heard someone describe it as the day we announced was actually day one of our crisis in terms of our crisis plan. Because, we went out, we announced 4 p.m. on September the 7th. And then, things just started, unraveling, right? So, again, we'd exercised a lot of these things. We'd exercised, tabletop exercises on crisis management plans and so on. But I think just the relentless news cycle, it was just, was sort of overwhelming. And then it wasn't helped by some things that, the company did or didn't do, which contributed, and, we would, whether it was the fact that, the executives had sold shares, and that was, there was an investigation announced on that. They were later found that they had no insider knowledge, but that was still a headline, right? There was the challenges we had with the website. There was challenges that were there was the call centers, that were getting backlogged. Not helped by the fact that Hurricane Irma had closed down one of the call centers, so that reduced capacity there, and just a ton of things that went on in that post-breach period that just, and of course the news media were just relentless going after that stuff.
And I think people forget that we had back-to-back hurricanes the week of the announcement.
Right.
We had Irma, Jose, and I think Michael. Is that right? 3 hurricanes.
Yeah, I know Irma was definitely...
Irma was in Houston.
Irma was approaching Florida at the time of because we were sharing the news, the headline with the Irma at that time, because I think it was on the...
And then a week later was I think, Jose. And that kind of came up Florida into Georgia.
Yeah.
I remember I was in D.C. when Jose... I was at Health and Human Services Secretary Operations Center. And we were watching... Right. And I was on the last flight out of D.C. to Atlanta with all the FEMA guys. As they were heading down to Atlanta to go to Valdosta, and they were going to move Valdosta. Did I say it right? Because Valdosta. Yeah. Sorry, he's from Macon, or as I like to call it, Macone. and it was very interesting. As we were about to take off, they had moved it from Valdosta to Alabama. Because of the trajectory of the hurricane, it was supposed to hit Valdosta, and that was no longer a good place for FEMA to set up. And here's an untold story. FEMA hires the worst people. Some people that FEMA hires are great. Other people FEMA hires, I want to know who in HR had those people hired. We were on a Delta flight. We were on the taxiway, getting ready to line up to take off from Reagan. The pilot has to get off, go back to the gate, and we had to deplane 3 FEMA employees who were not feeling well to fly.
Interesting.
How convenient, wearing their FEMA shirts. And I'm like, you just don't want to go and be at the hurricane. And you realize that if you don't fly now, you won't have to fly there later. You don't have to be there for the hard work. So they delayed our flight by an hour and 15 minutes because they had luggage on the plane. Right. So they had to get their luggage off for us to fly back. And we barely made it in time. I mean, I had never seen us get so fast from D.C. to Atlanta before. I think it was like a 42-minute flight, 44-minute. I don't know how much fuel Delta burned on that flight.
Wow.
But it was... I was watching as the hurricanes were coming up, and I was on the Hill that week talking to a few people about the breach.
Yep.
And they were like, what do you think we should be doing? You know, and so forth. It was right when the discussions between, you know, the different various political powers were starting to...
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the other thing that happened, right? I mean, as soon as... it wasn't very long until, you know, there was investigations...
and inquiries.
Inquiries, you know, the House said they were going to do hearings. The Senate said they were going to do hearings.
But that's how you became famous. Was the hearings.
The hearings, yeah.
That's how you became famous. I mean, that's how you wrote a book.
Yeah. That's right.
On it. I mean...
Right. So, so that was interesting. So... you know, so I was busy involved in, so the public, they went
public September 7th.
September 7th. And, you know, within a couple of weeks, it was announced that my boss, who was the global CIO, Dave Webb, and Susan Walden, the CISO, were retiring immediately. And, you know, based on what other breaches I'd observed and, you know, my experience in security, I thought, oh, well, that's it probably. That's the management accountability right there. And
then Rick Smith.
And then Rick Smith, the 24th, I think it was, September.
With $90 million.
He had a good retirement package, yep. And then I thought, well, that's it, right? And then October 3rd, October 2nd, I should say, I get called into to meet with the HR officer and was told that I was being terminated.
For?
Well, at that stage, it was as a result of the investigation into the breach. And when I pressed for more information, I was told that I didn't forward an email, which I didn't understand what that meant at that time. But that became clear the next day. See, the next day... I was at home watching Rick Smith testify in up at and several. I think there was 7 testimonies that week, in the House and Senate, and so he started reading his testimony and talking about the cause of the breach was human error and a technological failure, and the technological failure was the security scanner, which didn't detect the existence of the Apache Struts vulnerability, and the human error was that the person responsible for applying the patch didn't do it. And then under further questioning, he elaborated and said, well, they didn't do that because the person failed to forward an email. And that was when I realized what they were talking about. Like, I was sitting at home and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm the human error.
you were the human error, and at that, I mean, I'm just curious. You're sitting on your couch. You're probably one of the only very few people watching C-SPAN at that moment. I think it's you and 12 retirement village communities.
I think that one there may have been more, because I know there were a lot of people who were interested to see what his testimony was.
I think no one was watching. Not a lot of people were watching it live. I think most people were kind of grasping it on Twitter, because there was. I remember watching it on Twitter. I was watching one of the tech bloggers on Twitter, kind of, blogging, and I remember he said it was a human error not forwarding an email. To which my reply was, "Are we in 2005, and do IT project management systems just not exist?"
Yeah,
and that was a really, really lame excuse, and that became a very popular meme.
Right.
I think Rick Smith had a very, very popular meme because of that.
Right. Yeah.
And
well, I mean, I was shocked. I was like, I was very surprised, and so that was obviously the next most stressful period of my life, I guess. I mean, what happened, like, for really shortly after that, just to add, to make it more pressure cooking, was I got a call from the Equifax HR team to say that there'd been a media inquiry about my name, and which I figured someone had. Someone had leaked my name, I guess, to the press, that I'd left, and I might be getting a call, and my name might go public, because at this stage, in Rick's testimony, he said, there was a human error and a technical failure, and he said both of the issues have been addressed, but he didn't name me or name anyone, right? So I thought, my name's going to be out there in the public arena, and anyway, so the folks at Equifax were concerned enough because of the threats that other executives had, that they gave me a security protection for me and my family for the next several days. But in the end, my name wasn't released. Not at that time, anyway. Not until December. Not until December of 2018.
No, not until the congressional report.
Not until the congressional report came out. Yeah.
Were you worried when the congressional report came out with your name in it?
So by that stage, a year later, I'd had, obviously, things had moved along a lot. I knew it was coming out. It wasn't a surprise. They told us that they were, and so I was ready for it. But yeah, it was sort of interesting to see. Interesting. It was sort of, a lot of people picked up that headline, and I saw my name quoted, Graeme Payne, the human error, Graeme Payne, cause of the breach, Graeme Payne. It didn't quite have the same effect a year later, but it was still, a lot of people called me and had said, when that report came out, and said, we know you're a good guy, and it's, we feel for you and that sort of thing. So that was, but that was also the time where I thought, well, I could just accept this, or I could turn this into a positive, and that's when I decided I'd write the book and start focusing on helping.
Kind of getting your story out there, because the congressional testimony doesn't exactly take your story; it takes your testimony,
right?
And you do very well, kind of fighting it all there. Your testimony was I thought was pretty good. I think the challenge was that people, I find it funny, but it's similar in every breach now, right? If you go through like a Twitter feed or a LinkedIn feed, everyone's picking that one line that serves their purpose best. And unfortunately, the human error.
Right. Well, I did get quoted, I think, 118 times in that report, but it was a day of testimony. I mean, that in itself was an interesting process, going through that testimony. So it was probably 16, 20 staff people in the room, because it was actually two committees that were actually doing a joint investigation. And it's interesting because the way it works is in that stage, the Republicans were in charge of the majority. So the majority goes first, and they have their own stenographer, and they ask their own set of questions, and they interview you for like 60 minutes. And then the Democrats come in, they bring in their own stenographer, they have their own set of questions, their own staff, and then they swap around again, and so you're doing this. And of course, they're coming at it from different angles, which is very interesting.
So we're divided by party when it comes to investigations and stenographers. We can't even agree on a common stenographer. Oh, if George Washington could see that now, he would roll over in his grave.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That is very troublesome, to say the very least. So why did you write the book?
Well, a couple of reasons, I think. One was I thought it's an interesting story. I wanted to get it out, and I think because that was one reason, and the other thing is I think other people can learn from a lot of the lessons that Equifax went through, and so that was my main motivation writing the book, was really to tell the story, but also hopefully there's something in there that people will be able to take away and improve their own approach or cybersecurity program, or the way they respond to breaches. Because I say my whole thing there is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So every company at some point will be breached, and so I think a lot of how you react is what's important. So having those response processes in place, and a lot of great lessons learned through the Equifax breach from that and other breaches.
So there's a very interesting kind of synopsis on that, because you kind of walked us through kind of from the moment we discovered in those 6 weeks until we went public. And you picture the amount of work, you picture just the people, the secrecy around it, the change in lifestyle, the change in everything because of that. But you guys were up against a nation state, and I think people know that now. They didn't know that then. I think most people at the time, when they think of cyber, they think of a kid in a basement hacking, and you guys weren't hacked by a kid in a basement. You guys were, I say you guys, but Equifax was hacked by a nation state that really is known for its data mining. I think the DOJ put it on Iran, right?
I don't think anyone's officially said.
Didn't the DOJ, Micah, can you look it up real quick? Can you see if I thought the DOJ charged 2 Iranians with the Equifax breach.
Not to my knowledge, but
I thought they did. But what? So kind of let's rewind real quick. What went wrong at Equifax? They say it's the human error. You didn't forward an email. I think anyone who's a security professional knows. Yeah. We call that bullshit.
Right.
My bullshit meter went up when Rick Smith said that. I'm not saying that because you're here. I've said that before.
Well, I think on that point, I think you got to recognize that when these sort of things happen, there's the lawyers get involved and everything. I mean, you're going to have you're going to try and isolate, right? That's just the nature of how companies respond to these sort of things. They want to try and isolate because if you can isolate and say, well, it was this particular process that fell apart, which to some extent is true, right? Because as I said, as we sort of started off, I mean, I think Equifax had a pretty good security program, but what fell apart? Well, there was problems in the patching process, as all the investigations pointed out, and then there was and a lot of these cases, it's the stars aligning, right, or the misaligning, I guess. There was the digital certificate that wasn't installed on the decryptor, and that therefore there was no the SSL transactions weren't able to be seen by the intrusion prevention detection systems. Therefore, the suspicious activity wasn't identified, and so so you've got these sort of multiple things going wrong or breaking down, and happening, and they sort of misalign in the way that this problem sort of happens. So I think that's. But it's just, to me that's the big issue, right?
It wasn't a bad program. It wasn't a misaligned IT or security program. It was patching, which Apache struts A lot of people say it's been out. It was out for a while,
Right.
but it's a very complex patch because it carries a lot of different business units, and patching doesn't always keep things functioning. And there's a need to update, test, patch, test, patch,
Yeah,
test.
patching's difficult. I mean, but the Senate report pointed out that TransUnion and Experian had Apache struts as well, and they were able to patch it. So, I mean, it should have been patched. There's no doubt about that. But the process fell apart somewhere, and the patch didn't get installed, right? And that happens in organizations, right? I mean, these things. Unfortunately, the defense in depth was the IDS and IPS. Well, there was a problem with that too, right? So here you got multiple sort of points of failure, if you like.
Right. I mean, the walls came crashing down. It was,
right.
If you compare it to natural disasters, it's no different than that hurricane that hit Louisiana in, I think, 2005, was it, or 2004? The hurricane that really dumped New Orleans.
Katrina.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the levees failed, and after that, it was just...
Right.
And here it was just one failure that...
Right. And then there was more. There was other things as well. So, I mean, there's just a series. So, cybersecurity is hard. It's hard to run in a big organization. There's no doubt about it. And that's why I think, you've got to spend as much effort on response as you do on prevention and detection, because it's going to happen. And as you say, when you've got the power of a nation state behind you, they're going to find a hole somewhere if they want to.
If they don't find the hole, they'll social engineer their way in.
Yeah.
OPM was an example of that when people want to get in. And so I find it really interesting, and I kind of want to go back and maybe slightly away from the book a little bit, and kind of, if we look at 2017, the year of the Equifax breach, was kind of the year of patching, right? A lot of breaches happened because of patching. And 2018 was the year of M&As, right, with Marriott and again, just not proper cyber due diligence. This year, we're 2019 now, it's third-party supply chain. What do you predict 2020 is going to look like? What's the next vertical? What's the next thing, right? Because, we look back at Capital One, insider threat, third party.
Right.
And we don't know that in Equifax case, that was the scenario as well. You guys had 17 acquisitions in that time period. You guys had multiple of new people coming on your network. I mean, forensics take a very long time. I think most people don't understand just how long forensics really do take. I have a good friend of mine who is the head of the forensics teams for the Secret Service, and forensics aren't always easy, and depending on how you manage your security program, sometimes your forensics isn't just as cut and dry as pulling a fingerprint. It's complex,
very complex. I mean, like in Equifax's case, even January of 2018, they were still adjusting the numbers, right, on impacted consumers, because there was additional analysis that was going on. So that forensic analysis goes on for a long time, and then you've got it's even hard to get really precise sometimes. There's still, I think, a little bit of an estimation in there. But anyway, back to your question on predictions. I don't know. There's just so much going on these days. Ransomware, and that's crazy. I mean, I thought you were going to say 2019 was the year of ransomware, because I tell you, we've had so many ransomware attacks this year.
I thought 2018 was also a year of ransomware, because with WannaCry and SamSam. It's funny, I saw a report this morning that said BECs took over ransomware as the most.
I saw that too, yeah.
As the most kind
of... And you don't hear about a lot of those.
No, because... that
was an insurance company, I think, that issued that report. And
correct.
So,
they're paying a ton.
They know,
because
they're paying it, yeah. But you don't; those things don't have the same public profile as a data breach.
Well, no one's going to say we paid. So, I reported this morning on our daily cyber briefing, and for those listening, it won't be this week's daily cyber briefing. Today's September 3rd, so you'd have to go back and listen to the September 3rd. But British CEO transfer $234,000 in a BEC through a deepfake voice of the German CEO of the mother company. Let that sink in.
Yeah.
It was a business email compromise that brought a phone call to the desk of the CEO of the British, essentially kid company of a German parent company, and he said, we need you to transfer $234,000 to this supplier in Hungary. We'll get you the money the next day or so, but transfer it now. And the CEO with saying, hey, I heard the guy's voice. I've spoken to him before a few times. Sounds the same thing. He had a German accent. Seemed completely legit. That, my friend, is scary.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then you go back to internal controls, right? You shouldn't. Where's the double authority? Where's
over the CEO?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, so it's
CEO to CEO. You're not talking about a CEO calling a CFO or an accounts payable or accounts receivable. Those are common.
Yeah. I don't know. If I was in accounting, I wouldn't be transferring money anywhere unless I had it. I had some support, right? So I want to get it in writing, or or I'd go and check with someone about it.
I find it really funny because the organizations, the companies, the big companies, the SAPs and the Oracles who really run the business process haven't yet figured out BEC and business processes when it comes to that.
Right.
And I'm wondering when they're going to and if they're going to. And I don't think it's impacting their business. They're selling more than ever. Salesforce has now become a major competitor to SAP and Oracle.
Right.
And I spoke to someone at Salesforce just recently, and I said, so what are you guys doing in terms of business processes and security controls to go, that's not our concern. I go, huh. So people are moving to more cloud-based, SaaS-based softwares for business operations, and they're thinking, I had a CIO of a very large company tell me this over lunch a month ago. I'm on Salesforce. I don't have to worry about a security breach. A CIO of a large $25 billion a year company. I'm moving to Salesforce. I've got no concerns in the world. It's their problem. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's your problem.
I do worry about that. I mean, I think the Amazon, the Capital One case was, a good wake-up call for people, right? That just because you're moving stuff to the cloud doesn't mean it's more secure inherently, right?
So I explain S3 buckets like websites. S3 is like Wix or WordPress. It's for an average organization who may not have a deep knowledge of cloud computing, and they go, all right, we'll just buy this shell and we'll move stuff to this shell, not quite understanding how to engineer it. And then they don't build it themselves. They're kind of, the controls are the controls, and no one ever looks at the controls of an S3 bucket. Like people never question a WordPress website with the plugins they buy in the store. They trust it like how you download an app from the Google Play.
Right.
They trust it.
Right.
And do you think that falls on WordPress and Salesforce and Oracle and SAP and Google to verify these apps, or is it on the consumer?
So I think they have I don't think the consumer is informed enough. How can this consumer?
Terms and conditions says it's your responsibility.
Yeah, I know. But the problem is, and how many people really read those, permissions that when it comes, this application.
You don't want to know that number.
I know, it's zero. It's close to zero.
There's James.
Okay, there's James, and then there's everyone else.
Yes.
I mean, really. So I think in those cases that they have to take some responsibility, in my view. Consumers don't understand that. They just, like you said, they think it's safe. It's coming from the Google Store or the App Store, right? It must be safe.
Let's not compare Google Play to the App Store. Apple's App Store is by far the most stringent process of getting an app on there that I've ever seen. I mean, you send them an app, they detect one thing of code, one line of code that just makes them feel wishy-washy, and they kick it back to you.
Yeah.
And there's no one to talk to. So if you don't do it their way for the very first time, you're going to waste valuable time and money going back and forth with them. Yeah. And I like that model. That's why I respect Apple a bit more than I do other companies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the case. So in your book, one of the things you talk about is kind of one of the lessons learned from the breach is you kind of go through kind of the board responsibility in the Equifax breach. You kind of talk a little bit about how boards need to be more involved. That was a discussion also after Equifax. That was kind of like board liability, board involvement. What can you share about that? Well, without giving away the book, because I want people to read the book.
Yeah. No, well, I think the board does need to. So the interesting thing in the Equifax case was the board met, I think it's like something like 76 times related to the breach. Most boards meet 4 to 6 times a year, maybe. So just to put it in perspective, so the board really gets engaged, or in this case, they get really engaged because you were dealing with this news media, we were dealing with the regulators. So my advice, and I can go in a lot more detail in the book, but my advice is you should have your board involved in your incident response crisis management process and exercise them in that process.
I found the part of the book. This is the first time seeing the hard copy, so I have it in the other format, and it's upstairs, and I didn't want to bring down a stack of papers this large. I think environmentalists would see that and scream at me for the amount of paper I've printed for it, so we're going to leave that out.
Yeah.
So in Chapter 8 of your book, and this is not a very large book, by the way. Right. It's not. It's an airplane read.
Yeah.
It's a 2-hour flight read if you're reading my rate. You kind of start talking about GDPR, some of the regulations around privacy and consumer. And I think one of the things some people understand and some people don't is you guys had to deal with 52 different attorney generals for data breach notification in the U.S. and U.S. territories alone.
That's right. Plus Canada, plus the UK.
Canadians, plus the UK. Plus. From an IT perspective, it feels like compliance equals security, but that's not really the case. How much of your effort in the kind of those 6 weeks from the moment you guys discovered the breach, of the 100 people on the team, how many of them were compliance folks, kind of focusing on the legal aspect of it versus the security aspect? If you could throw a percentage.
I just probably 20%, I would say.
Legal, kind of dealing with
20 to 25%, probably, yeah.
How much? So, kind of one of the things being advocated is a general federal data breach notification law, general federal privacy law. I don't know if it's similar to GDPR. Mm-hmm. I personally feel GDPR is a hoax. I don't think GDPR gives you any privacy. I think it gives you what I like to call the fake European control of your data. When you really don't have it, you have the right to be forgotten until you're re-engaged. I love that, right? I can forget you, but the moment you're re-engaged, I can restore your old data. Because that's all GDPR does. In your book, you talk a little bit about that.
I think that we're never going to get there. I mean, not in the near future anyway, because there's just too much. Just our government machinery is not going to allow that to happen, I don't think. I think the problem is you've got competing interests in the legislature. You've got every state doing their own thing. You've got which federal agency is going to regulate it, right? You've got the FTC. You've got, if you're in healthcare, you've got a different regulator. If you're a bank, you've got a different regulator. So how do you reconcile all of those different turf wars about who's really going to, if you're going to try and get a universal regulation or universal legislation. I just don't see it.
So I'm for demolishing existing agencies and creating one new one that's very efficient, not like a typical bureaucratic government agency. Now, I know I live in a daydream and that will never happen. Well, I don't know. With our president, this may happen. I don't know. I mean, I think if I can get Trump's ear for 15 minutes, please someone forward this next bit to the president. Corey, buddy, send you the skit. Please, God, please forward it to your former boss. So if we were to get rid of the FTC, it serves the Federal Trade Commission was established to get rid of monopolies. It no longer does that. It is a bureaucratic organization that needs to be gutted. I mean, we both know Michael Daughtry, our good friend here from The Devil in the Beltway. I've had him on the show before. He's also got a really interesting book of how the FTC came after his small business on an FTC vendor-funded security research program that ended up costing him millions and millions of dollars. His company, his cancer research center, his cancer detection center, absolutely infuriates me. I love Michael to death. I think it took a very successful small business and demolished it, and the FTC can't do that to Equifax. Equifax has public shareholders. You can't really pick on them. You can go settle with them, but you can't really pick on them like they could pick on Michael. I feel like that organization needs to be gutted. We need to establish an internet trade commission. Period. And that's the body that enforces privacy and security guidelines. And you can roll everything under that one agency.
Yeah.
You can roll HIPAA and HITRUST and FFEIC and you name it. Put it on there.
So when you're running for political office?
I don't know that she could pay me enough to run for political office at this point. I feel like that's one of the challenges is when you talk about and you talk about it in your book, and so eloquently, by the way, is you go, we're never going to see this stuff get better in our lifetime because there's just so much politics and manipulation around it. And the fact is, you're right, consumers don't care. How do we get consumers to care? How do we, as practitioners, as cybersecurity folks, how do we get Joe Smith, who... sorry, Micah. You don't have an uncle by the name of Joe, right?
No.
Okay, good. Micah's last name is Smith, so I'm trying to be... I'm sorry. Yeah. Should I go with Collins? Would that be better for you?
That's fine.
Joe Collins, who shops at Walmart. How do we get him to care about security? How do we get him to care about his privacy? I don't have the answer to that.
I don't have the answer either, but it's a challenge. I agree.
When you look at kind of post, I always like to say cybersecurity had pre-Equifax and post-Equifax. That's kind of like the time of Christ in cybersecurity, right? Because pre-Equifax, we had Chase, OPM, Target,
Home Depot.
Those came and went 2-3 days in the news cycle. Target, most people don't know this, they eliminated 2,000 jobs post-breach. What happened at Equifax?
So, I mean, it's obviously, I haven't been there since October the 2nd of 2017, but I obviously still followed the stories and connected with a lot of people. You know, the company's is going through a rebuilding of, transformation on rebuilding trust. And so, they've brought in new leadership, new CISO. Now they've changed governance, so the CISO now reports directly to the CEO. The board's taken on new principles and new guidance, new requirements around escalation of cyber incidents and so on. In the immediate aftermath, the revenue of the company was suffered a little, and I think is still doing it's still under pressure, I think, although the stock price has largely recovered. So there's obviously the market thinks there's a long term the company will be okay. They're spending a tremendous amount of money, spent over $1 billion on legal fees, remediation, technology transformation.
$1 billion.
Over $1 billion. Plus there was the $700 million settlement recently. There's still two class action lawsuits going through the court. There's the financial services one and the shareholder derivative lawsuit. So, I mean, this thing goes on. And then I think there's just the, because of all that pressure, all those additional costs are incurring, obviously, to maintain margins, what do? You just look at your cost structure. And so there's been some restructuring, I think, pretty much every quarter since last year, in the last couple of years, that they've their financials report that they're doing reduction in force adjustments through their financial statements. So they're basically laying people off to manage their costs. So and some good friends of mine have lost their jobs because they've restructured the teams, and so the impacts go on for a long time. Is the bottom line.
It doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away, and it'll take many years, I think, in my view.
So Equifax kind of became you were one of the only folks to really lose his job post breach. Everyone else was allowed to retire and kind of walk away. When you look at the timing of the time you were laid off to when Mr. Smith went to Congress to testify, you kind of get the idea that this had to be done before he sat down in that chair to say this problem was dealt with. Otherwise, it'd look really, really bad. The optics of it would have been horrendous. You've been labeled a human error. You've now written the book, obviously, and you're trying to recover. But what toll has this taken on you personally? I mean, the last few years. We're almost 2 years, 4 days away from being 2 years from it being announced.
Right.
So what toll has this taken on you personally?
Well, I'm a pretty positive person, so I tend to look on the things in a positive way. So,
correct.
But I mean, naturally, there's been ups and downs through that period. Obviously, I've certainly been through job interviews. People, obviously it's people. It's a topic, right? You got to talk about it, and so I generally talk about it be very upfront and say, "Yep, this happened. This is what happened. This is what my perspective of it was." Most people in the industry recognize it for what it was, and don't hold that against you, which is great.
Other CISOs, other CIOs don't,
right?
But the CEOs, the COOs, right, the CFOs. Chief risk officers, those guys, they look at you and go, you were the fall guy. You were it. You were the reason.
Right.
How do we fix that? Because you weren't.
Well, I actually, the blame game in general in security is something that I'm really, I've actually blogged about on a couple of different things. Right. I wrote an article about who in their right mind would want to be a CISO, because, it's a stressful job. And not that I was a CISO, but I was worked closely with CISO. But it's a stressful job. And, whenever these things happen, we want to blame. Someone's going to get blamed, and generally it's the head of IT and the head of security, and often they're not the. I mean, you can't just lay the blame there, because most of the time these are either the program hasn't been well invested enough, or they've been pointing out the risks, and they just the management hasn't done something about them, or the board hasn't been engaged enough, or whatever. So we tend to blame. The blame game is, let's blame someone, let's pinpoint it on someone, and then and I wish we got away from that. And I don't know exactly how we get away from that, but I think we have to have this discussion. And that one of the things I mentioned in my article is that if I was CISO today, I'd be having that discussion with my board today, right? About, okay, what's going to happen if a breach occurs, and am I going to be the fall person? And if I am, let's talk about what's going to happen. So you've got sort of you can discuss that when you're not under duress of a pressure of a breach.
Do you feel like that was lacking at Equifax?
I I don't know what Susan had negotiated or discussed, so I can't really comment on. I just don't know. But I think it's a good practice for CISOs to have that discussion.
When I think of kind of reading the congressional testimony, going through your book, obviously, and kind of the personal toll it would take on someone from, like you said, you go to job interviews, and most of the time it may not even be a job interview. They just want the insight as to what really happened at Equifax. What is not written down that you can tell me,
right,
that I can find out now so that I can go internally and look at it. Has this impacted, has this had a toll also on obviously your reputation is one toll that this takes away with. We did a shirt called Chief Chief Internal Scapegoat Officer? Sorry. Chief Internal Scapegoat Officer? Yeah, we did a shirt and a mug that people can buy on our website that says Chief Internal Scapegoat Officer, because that's really what a CISO stands for.
Right.
So, having said that, do you feel like head of IT, head of securities, they're constantly dealing with the stress of it? What tips would you give them in terms of that conversation with the board? How do you secure your role? How do you get people ready to understand it's not if, like you said, it's when.
Mm-hmm.
And when it happens, here are the things we need to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we saw that with Chase, by the way. I mean, Chase before Equifax, they still kept the same CISO. Target didn't have a CISO when they were breached. They fired their head of IT.
Right. And then the CEO.
Yes.
A few months later. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's, well, for one, it's a couple of things. I think one is, I think whether it's a CISO or the head of IT, I think you've got to explain the risks, because at some point the investment's going to come to a certain level, and you may say, well, look, we've got like 20 things to do, but we can only afford to do 5. So let's prioritize what the 5 things are and go to the board and say, I really need funding for this, and these are the risks associated with this. And if you can't fund these things, then you just need to understand that these are the risks that might happen. And then you're informed, right? Then they're informed. So I think that's one thing, guys. And then the other thing is, I would like to see more boards engaging specialists, cybersecurity specialists, to help them. Because part of the issue, I think, is the board members don't know what questions they should be asking of management to evaluate whether their approach, their program is sound. And if they don't know what questions to ask, then they certainly don't know how to evaluate the answers, right? So over time, hopefully, in 15, 20 years, maybe we've got more digitally aware directors on boards. But today, many boards don't. And I really think that, and where do you get that from? Well, you can get it from people that have the technical expertise, but we need to start grooming those people to serve on boards. And if in the meantime, we need to have them bring those experts in to help consult with them and coach them. And that's what I'm doing now, is working in that space. So really helping to both CISOs and CIOs talk to boards, and then have boards coaching board members and what they should be asking of the CISOs and the heads of IT.
It seems like that's one of the criticisms on Equifax, was that the board had no one on the board that was anywhere near coherent on security to be able to even ask the right questions. And I don't know if that to be true or not. I think, well, if you look at all the reports, I mean, they definitely, they had briefings and all that sort of thing. I mean, I think just generally, I would say in most boards there's just not that level of expertise, right? And that's not surprising given the composition of most of these boards, right? They're mostly, if you look at the type of people that make up boards of public companies, retired CEOs of. Most of them are retired CEOs of companies that have other Fortune 500.
Right. So, so it's interesting. If you think about like what happened in after the financial crisis, what happened there? We had Sarbanes-Oxley, and boards were required to have a qualified financial executive on the board, so someone who really understand finance and accounting, and so that they could make the inquiries of the auditors, could make the inquiries of management, so they knew what the company was doing, right? Well, why don't we have a qualified technology executive on the board? Someone that can really ask the questions about the way the company's using technology, how they're securing it, what the risks are. And so
Sorry to interrupt, but I think those are, you're talking about, I think, 3 different roles. So most boards have someone who understands some level of technology on the board, but they don't understand security. I mean, we saw that with one company here in Atlanta where they took a CTO and made him a CISO.
Right.
The person understood nothing on security, nothing against him. Greatest guy in the world, lovely person, sweetest person I've ever met in my life. Love him to death. Does not understand security. Does he belong on a board? Does he belong in a CISO role? No, but somehow he was given a CISO role even though he had no security experience. So we still see these mistakes happening.
But could that, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, but could that person...
We could talk about it off record.
But could that person translate? Because I think that part of a big job of the CISO today is actually be able to communicate and articulate those risks to the board, right? You need to have enough understanding to be able to, work with your specialist to understand what those risks are, and then how do you convert that into a language that the board's going to understand? And sometimes in some organizations, you may not necessarily need to have the highly technical expertise. You just need to be, if you're a good communicator and you can understand it and understand what your people are telling you, and then be able to translate that into and you may be a really effective CISO.
So yes, you're absolutely right. I think part of that has to do though with that some CISOs maybe get 15 minutes or an hour a year with the board. They don't get a lot of time. Number one. Number two, in that period of time, they're filtered down through messaging, meaning they're asked to prepare their presentation a week before, so it goes to the CIO that says, get rid of all of this. You're only going to talk about this. That kicks it back. That then the CIO kicks it to the CEO, who kicks it back and says, fix all these things, and you end up with a watered down message.
Yeah, I agree that's happening. That is happening, but that's where I go back to, if you've got the smart directors that understand it. They don't have to understand it to the bits and bytes level, but they need to understand to be able to ask the right questions of whoever's giving that report.
Correct. Right? I agree with you. I've looked at, so I want to take Capital One as a prime example. Michael, he's the CISO there. He's still in his role, at least from the looks of it. His space seems to be secure, and I'd be very surprised if it wasn't. I think that'd be a horrible decision by the Capital One management to get rid of him. I felt like they did an exceptional job dealing from the moment they discovered it, which was through a bug bounty email, external bug bounty program. Most companies don't even take those seriously.
Right.
That sits on the back end queue.
Right.
They got an email on the 17th. They recognized that it was real on the 19th, deployed it, and by the 28th, they went public with it.
Yep.
They did I felt like they did a really good job.
Agreed.
I hope he stays in his role. I've been holding fingers for him, praying he stays in his role, because I felt like if that's a perfect playbook, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, something came in, we've detected it, let's deploy. 9 days later, you've got an arrest. They had law enforcement on board. I mean, think about that.
I know, it was impressive, and their response to the consumers, all the FAQs, and here's what we're doing. It was
part of that was your work. I think part of the playbook that I think people from the outside look at Equifax and go, "What a disaster." People from the inside, we appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right, because you only learn by mistakes.
Right.
Some of the mistakes, you folks did in what was an unprecedented kind of breach at the time. And that's another thing people don't quite comprehend is you guys literally had no one to look to and go.
Right. And then on top of that, it's one of the most publicly discussed, right? Because you've had all these investigations and the public reports, the FTC, GAO, Senate, House.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's the data?
The Canadian Privacy Commissioner. I mean, there's so many. I think it is. I mean, I think here's a company that was a trusted, data is their business.
So, do you think the government should take over? should we trust the government like we trusted OPM?
No. I mean, I think I was mentioning to you before the podcast that in some countries the government runs the
that's a scary thought.
Credit reporting bureaus, but that's mainly probably just because of the infrastructure getting those things started.
So I remember when I lived in Israel, they don't really have a credit bureau agency. They're now building it, and the company building it is Dun & Bradstreet of all companies, which I found very surprising, Dun & Bradstreet to be in this game, because they were in the business game. I didn't know they were going into the consumer space, but I guess they figured, hey, businesses connect with consumers. If businesses trust us, consumers should be able to do that too. And Dun & Bradstreet's kind of running it.
Remember, they're getting the data off the businesses anyway, right?
Right.
Because it does make sense.
I mean, I remember when my partner and I, Corinne, who you just met before the podcast, when we opened our company in Israel, we got our first contract. One of our first big deals with Kaplan, the huge education. So they were like, we need your Dun & Bradstreet number. And we're like, what's that? Right? We're new to business. We didn't know what that is. So we had to go to Dun & Bradstreet and get a Dun & Bradstreet number. We had to go to their offices in Tel Aviv to do it and fill it out. And you had to submit your IDs. And they give you a Dun & Bradstreet number. Then they try to upsell you all these services. And then you kind of get that. And I felt like in the States, we never really had that. I remember being 18, no one really teaches you how to manage your credit. And no one's really teaching you why to care for your data. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you're right. I felt like, personally speaking, though, I thought that the 2014 Chase breach was far worse than Equifax. Financially speaking, that was $2 billion.
Yeah. Half of the U.S. households and 7 million small businesses.
Right. It's $2 billion. People don't talk about it.
Yeah.
We caught the perpetrators. They're sitting in jail.
Right.
But they literally breached the system, took the data, ran pump and dump schemes using those companies, phishing their clients, and then running call centers from all over the world, calling these customers, going like, hey, we're from Chase. We sent you this email for this opportunity on this penny stock. You want to buy it? Great, buy it. That's crazy. No one talks about it. Nothing. And I'm like, that's $2 billion that we can account for. Think that we probably can't account for $2 billion more.
Right.
No one talks about it. But Equifax, we can't prove damages. Yes, Equifax is a trusted data source, but you can't prove damages with it. If you freeze your credit, if you tokenize people's identities within the next 5 years, all that data becomes useless. Am I right or am I wrong? You feel free. I mean, I'm on my rant, but it's one of those where I go, I can solve the Equifax from let's tokenize everyone's data. It's not that hard. Government builds a private public blockchain. Mm-hmm. People's information, everyone gets a key.
Yep.
It's tokenized. Your information's there. You get to control based on your key who gets access to your data. Want to give it to the car dealership? Great. Want to give it to your bank? Fine. They got to have your token.
Yep. Yeah.
We've solved it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think blockchain's an interesting opportunity and threat to the credit reporting agencies, right? I mean,
it's a threat for them at the moment.
It could be an opportunity, but it's a threat. It's definitely.
They don't want to invest the billions of dollars that it takes to rebuild a crumbling infrastructure with something that's like blockchain. It's very interesting because from a healthcare perspective, there's massive projects between HHS and different private enterprise on blockchain, which I think we're not seeing.
How many years do you think we're away from having that?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a lot.
I think years away from it is money. It's money versus breakthrough. Mm-hmm. And people still consider blockchain to be part of Bitcoin. There's been a steady stream of media that's now kind of transforming blockchain away from Bitcoin, getting technology people to think of blockchain in a different light. But, I mean, I've hacked the blockchain before. Went to companies and showed them what we've been able to do on their blockchain, and kind of given them the blueprint of where the security flaws lie. I'm not saying blockchain's perfect, but I'm not talking about blockchain as a replacement to consumer data or taking away the Equifax, TransUnion, or Experian business model. But if we just tokenize people's information, we tokenize it. So you no longer are Graeme Payne. I'm James Azar, and he's Micah Smith. We're 17DEF whatever, and he's, whatever, and I'm whatever. And you're tokenized, and the only way people can access your identity is with your token.
Right. And you can give them approval to do that.
Correct.
So it changes the control model.
Correct.
Right.
Changes the control model from sign a piece of paper for consent, which you and I both know is very easy to do, and no one sends a signed piece of paper to Equifax, and Equifax doesn't look at the signature and go, oh, that's not Micah Smith's signature. It's electronic to begin with. It's been electronic for years.
Right.
It used to be by fax in the 80s. You know how I know that? My dad had a car dealership. When someone wanted to come and buy a car in the 80s, I kid you not.
Oh, yeah. Used to fax.
He used to fax it into the credit bureau, and the credit bureau had fax lines.
Mm-hmm.
They would get it, they would look at it, they would match the signature to the signature on file.
Yep, that's right.
And only then they would fax you back the person's credit report.
Well, before that, it used to be by phone.
Call in.
Call in.
Call centers.
Yeah, they call in and say, hey, I want to offer credit to James. And someone would run to an index card and look it up because they didn't have electronic records, so they'd look you up, and then in fact, the stories of some of the runners actually having roller skates, and they'd roller skate down to the index cards. They'd look through probably tens of thousands of index cards to find you. They'd locate your card, and then they'd roller skate it back to the operator who would then read out your credit information.
That's hilarious.
I think we should go back to that. I feel like America's gotten fat. Back then, America was skinny because people were roller skating at work.
There we go.
Right? You had more of a personal interaction, so you felt better with your buy.
Yep.
Today, we're Amazon slaves. I ran out of espresso capsules, and Espresso still won't sponsor my show and send me free Nespressos. We have problems.
That's a real problem.
It's a horrible problem, but I feel like if we just tokenized, there'd be no impact from this breach. And I'll tell you what my scariest part of the Equifax breach has been is the international ramifications of it. Someone can take my identity, and I'm more worried about it from the Marriott breach, because in the Marriott breach, my passport number was compromised.
Right.
And to open any foreign banking account, you need a passport number, not a social. People don't know that. But if someone's doing the right data mining, I got your data from Equifax, got your data from Marriott. I can go duplicate your identity. No one knows what you look like. I can create a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page. No one would know. Do you Google yourself?
Mm-hmm.
How often?
Every now and then, not regularly.
It's the human error. I think. Hey. So if you're listening, here's the deal, guys. Everyone's got to go get a copy of the book, and then review it so we can get positive SEO, so that everything comes out as a brilliant book that he's written. Positive SEO, and get rid of the stupid congressional report and Rick Smith's dumb testimony. I'm sure he's sitting on some boat somewhere laughing. Ha ha ha, $90 million. Well done, sir. Well played. Isn't he your uncle or something? You guys share a last name. Aren't you all like the Smith clan related?
It's a pretty big clan.
Is it a big clan? But yeah, it's...
and male pattern baldness does not run
No, you've got a really healthy. You've inspired me. I never used to grow my hair, but Micah, he's always like doing this with his hair, and I've started growing my hair with the hope of one day being able to have strong. I'm using Head and Shoulders too because that's what he uses. So I'm trying to emulate the Smith clan hair from Macon, Georgia. Which is absolutely magnificent. Your little boy's hair, by the way, he's got a little kid with a set of hair. I've never seen anything like it before. He makes Leo Messi's hair look like garbage.
Nice.
Garbage. And you know Messi because you're from New Zealand. You're a soccer guy.
Or rugby is more my sport, but
you know, I spent 3 months in Australia, and it was really funny to me to see. It's like the Australia-New Zealand relationship is very much like the U.S.-Canada relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It is very much like the U.S.-Canada.
Yep.
We tolerate each other. But you put a Canadian in the room, we're like, what's he doing here? And it's the same way with like Australia-New Zealand.
Especially on the sports field.
Especially on
the sports field. The All Blacks and the Wallabies, rugby or cricket or netball or whatever it is, it's crazy competition.
Did you play rugby as a kid?
I did. Every kid in New Zealand plays rugby as a kid.
So there's that fight song. What's it called?
The Haka?
The Haka. Do you know how to do it?
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Will you teach me? I've tried to learn it like online through YouTube, and I can't.
Yeah, it's pretty special. It's pretty special when it's performed. Like the high school I went, every high school had their own Haka. So
there's different versions.
Different versions. Yeah, the one the All Blacks does just one particular, but every sort of tribe and had their own Haka, and so every high school has one. And when the high schools play each other in rugby, the whole school lines up and does the Haka on the side of the field. It's pretty impressive.
Wow. Reasons for James to return to New Zealand. When's rugby season?
Well, it's our summer, so you have to go in our summer because it's winter down there.
Okay, so your summer would be January to June.
Right.
Awesome. I was in Australia from January to March.
Oh, okay.
Great time.
Great time, yeah.
Wow. I was in Melbourne. Wow. Loved it. Could technically live there if they'd take me, but I don't think Australians would give me a visa to live there. They'd be like, we want your kind around here. Have you ever seen like the border control at New Zealand and Australia? Like how strict they are?
Oh, yeah. Oh, they're really strict.
My God.
Yeah. I saw a guy, I was coming back from Australia into New Zealand, and, we sort of share of, in fact, you didn't even need, you do now, but back then you didn't even need to have passports to have travel between the two countries. We were that tight together. I saw a guy, he'd come from China, I think, or somewhere in the Asia area. He had an orange. They were about to deport him because he was trying to bring an orange into the country. Because because of the agricultural economy, they're totally, concerned about anyone bringing in anything that could have harm the economy there.
I was fascinated by that. First time I ever saw the Haka, by the way, was when I worked at Verizon in 2006. Like when YouTube was just getting started, our district manager at the time for Verizon, a guy by the name of Mike Grip, he brought us into one of our staff meetings for all the managers, and he put the Haka on the projector, and he goes, "You guys want to put fear in people? Watch this." And we were like, unbelievable. And that was 13 years ago. And to think about it nowadays, it's pretty crazy. Next time you're with a board, you should teach them the Haka.
Yeah.
I think that would be a cool, like security
team building exercise.
Yeah. You're gonna learn the Haka now. Let's go. That's awesome. So the book is The New Era of Cybersecurity Breaches, can be found on Amazon, correct?
Yes.
Thank you for coming by.
Thank
Finally.
You. Yes, it's been fun. Enjoyed it.
I'm very excited for next week, and well, for the listeners, this won't go out till the week after the summit, correct?
Saturday after.
The Saturday after. So will be after CyberHub Summit, but I'm sure we'll talk at the summit as well. We may do a short interview there as well, kind of doing a live promo of the book ahead of that. But I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. Awesome book. Everyone should pick up a copy of it. There's lessons learned in there. It's really, really valuable. It's not, I like to call, it's not one of those cyber books where you get no value out of it, where it's just kind of repeating a bunch of blog posts. This really does, you really did invest a good amount of time and information in there. Very, very good book. Graeme, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Those listening, again, the link to get Graeme's book is at the description of our podcast on YouTube, on iTunes.
No, there's not enough character space for iTunes.
Micah says there's not enough character space to put it, but you can go to Amazon. We'll put the description of the book in here so you can go get it on Amazon as well. Support Graeme and everything he's been through over the last 2 years. And hopefully you'll get as much value from his book as I have, because it's really been insightful. Till next week, I'll be back with more. You're listening to the CyberHub Engage podcast, and I am James Azar.